I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are holding the literal power to destroy the world right in your hands.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a terrifying thought.
Right. You are looking at a device, a creation of your own mind, and, with absolute certainty that once you unleash it, history can never be reversed.
It is just a staggering burden. I mean, we tend to assume that the people making those universe-altering decisions are fundamentally different from us.
Yeah.
Like they are entirely rational, utterly certain, totally unshakable.
Exactly. But what if the person holding that power was just as contradictory, just as restless, and really just as human as anyone else? So today we are taking a deep dive into the life, the brilliance, and the incredibly tragic arc of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
The father of the atomic bomb.
You probably know him by that title, yeah. But our mission today is to venture far beyond that mushroom cloud. We are pulling from comprehensive biographical profiles and historical records to really unpack the contradictions of this guy.
And there are so many contradictions.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is a man who mathematically predicted black holes, read ancient Sanskrit texts for fun, built a weapon of mass destruction, and was ultimately destroyed by the very government he built it for.
It's a wild trajectory.
Yeah.
To understand how someone arrives at that specific crossroads of history, you really have to look at how his mind functioned before the world ever knew his name.
Right.
Before he could change the world, Oppenheimer was this erratic prodigy, desperately struggling to figure out how his own brain worked.
The early environment he grew up in really set a very specific stage for that, too. He was born into a wealthy, non-observant Jewish family in New York, and he attended the Ethical Culture Society school.
Right, the Ethical Culture Society. That is a really important detail.
Yeah, and the motto of that school was deed before creed, which is a philosophy that essentially dictates that your moral actions in the real world matter far more than whatever specific religious dogmas you might hold.
That philosophy is crucial. It planted this seed of deep moral responsibility that you can trace through his entire life. But intellectually, I mean, he was brilliant right out of the gate.
Oh, complete.
He graduated from Harvard with a chemistry degree in just 3 years.
3 years, wow.
Yeah, but the trouble started when he went to Cambridge in England for graduate work. He was assigned to do experimental physics in a laboratory, and the reality is he was incredibly clumsy.
Like dropping beakers kind of clumsy?
Pretty much. He was suffocating in that physical environment. He suffered from intense depression, neglected to eat, and exhibited some, well, deeply erratic behavior.
Erratic is almost an understatement. There is a documented incident where he actually tried to strangle a friend simply because the friend told him about a marriage proposal.
Yeah, that really highlights how unstable he was at the time.
And then there's the famous story about his tutor, Patrick Blackett. Oppenheimer supposedly left a poisoned apple on Blackett's desk.
Right, the poisoned apple story.
Now, historians still debate the veracity of that story. It remains unsubstantiated. But the fact that it is even plausible within his biography tells you everything you need to know about his mental state at Cambridge.
He was completely mismatched with the physical demands of experimental lab work. The real turning point came when he left Cambridge for the University of Göttingen in Germany to study theoretical physics under Max Born.
A completely different environment.
Exactly. The theoretical realm was where his mind actually belonged. He wasn't fumbling with lab equipment anymore. He was working entirely in the abstract universe of ideas.
And he thrived there, right?
Thrived is putting it mildly. He became so vocal and enthusiastic in those discussions that he would completely take over the seminars. It got to the point where another student organized a petition threatening a boycott unless the professor made Oppenheimer quiet down.
Okay, let's unpack this. He had a massive intellectual appetite, and the scientific contributions he made during this period were staggering. For example, he co-wrote the Born-Oppenheimer approximation.
Yes, a foundational concept.
But let's break that down because, it sounds like dense textbook jargon. What is the actual mechanism of that approximation, and why does it matter?
Well, think about trying to calculate the intricate orbital paths of the planets in our solar system. But the sun is constantly jiggling around, throwing off all your math.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Right. That is what early quantum physicists were dealing with when trying to calculate the behavior of molecules. Oppenheimer and Max Born realized that the atomic nucleus is so massive compared to the tiny electrons orbiting it that you can essentially treat the nucleus as if it is standing perfectly still.
Oh, I see. So it simplified the math to a point where quantum chemistry actually became workable.
Precisely. It unlocked an entire field. And he didn't stop there. He predicted the existence of the positron.
Which is antimatter, right?
Exactly. He even co-wrote papers specifically establishing the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit that mathematically predicted the existence of neutron stars and black holes.
Wait, he predicted black holes back in the 1930s.
Yes, he was charting out the gravitational collapse of dying massive stars in 1939, decades before observational astronomy could catch up and prove him right.
So he is synthesizing all these radically different ideas from astrophysics to quantum mechanics. It sounds a bit like a visionary startup founder,
Hiding it.
like the kind of person who has these massive world-altering vision, but who you absolutely cannot trust to do the basic bookkeeping. One of his own students, Hartland Snyder, even said, his physics was good, but his arithmetic awful.
What's fascinating here is that is a perfect analogy. His broad intellectual appetite made him the ultimate synthesizer of ideas, but it actively prevented him from achieving traditional academic milestones like, say, winning a Nobel Prize.
Really? He never won a Nobel?
Never. In physics, there is a German concept called Sitzfleisch, literally sitting flesh. It means having the sheer patience to sit in a chair for years and grind through grueling, hyper-specific calculations on a single problem.
And I'm guessing Oppenheimer did not have that.
Oppenheimer completely lacked Sitzfleisch. He would have a brilliant flash of insight, sketch out the theoretical architecture in a short paper, and then immediately get bored and move on to the next mystery.
Which explains why a mind that restless couldn't just live in the abstract math forever. It needed a grounding reality, and he managed to find that grounding in two completely different spheres.
The desert and politics.
Exactly. The stark isolation of the American desert and radical 1930s politics.
Yeah. After recovering from a mild case of tuberculosis in New Mexico, he leased a remote ranch. He named it Perro Caliente, which translates to hot dog.
Hot dog, that's great.
He famously declared that his two great loves were physics and desert country. The utter silence and starkness of the desert seemed to be the only thing capable of quieting the relentless noise in his head.
Yet while he was escaping to the desert, he was astonishingly insulated from society. Like, by his own admission, he was so politically uninformed during his 20s that he didn't even learn about the 1929 Wall Street crash until 6 months after the fact.
6 months later. That is incredible.
Right. And he didn't cast his first vote until 1936. But when that political awakening finally happened, it hit him like a freight train.
The rise of fascism in Europe shifted him rapidly to the left. He started funding Spanish Republican causes. He also found himself surrounded by people actively involved in the Communist Party USA.
A lot of people very close to him, too.
Yeah, his brother Frank, his wife Kitty, and his mistress Jean Catlock were all members.
And looking at the historical record, there is still a lot of debate over the exact nature of his involvement. Some argue he was a concealed member of the party, while others maintain he was just a fellow traveler.
Right, someone who sympathized with the anti-fascist pro-labor goals, but refused to be bound by strict party doctrine.
Regardless of the label, the FBI opened a file on him in 1941 and began tracking him.
And this political radicalization was happening simultaneously with a deep dive into mysticism.
Yeah, this is the part that really surprised me.
He learned Sanskrit simply so he could read Hindu classics in their original text. He kept a worn copy of the Bhagavad Gita on his desk, calling it the most beautiful philosophical song in any known tongue.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on the logic of what happens next.
Sure, go for it.
You have a man who is incredibly restless, surrounded by left-wing political associations that have already triggered an FBI file, and who translates ancient Hindu philosophy between quantum physics lectures.
It is a unique resume.
How does a person with that specific profile get selected to lead the most sensitive, highly classified military weapons project in United States history?
It seems completely counterintuitive on paper, I agree. His colleague, Isidore Isaac Rabi, noted that Oppenheimer had a feeble sense of earthiness.
Able earthiness.
He was always somewhat in the clouds, treating physics almost as a hobby, while viewing psychoanalysis and mysticism as his true vocation. But that exact spiritual, almost ethereal quality gave him a hypnotic, mesmerizing charisma.
So people were just drawn to him.
Young scientists didn't just respect his intellect, they were captivated by him. They adopted his mannerisms, his speech patterns. He possessed an extraordinary aura of leadership that compelled brilliant people to follow him.
And General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, recognized that unique gravity.
Groves was tasked with building the atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could.
And he appoints Oppenheimer to head the secret weapons lab, despite the lack of a Nobel Prize, the lack of administrative experience, and the glaring political background.
Groves saw past the paper trail. He recognized that inventing an entirely new class of weapon wasn't just a theoretical physics problem.
It was everything all at once.
Right. It required metallurgy, chemistry, ordnance engineering, and fluid dynamics. Because Oppenheimer was that ultimate synthesizer who lacked Sitzfleisch, the guy who constantly jumped between disciplines. He was the only person capable of holding all those different sciences in his head at the same time.
He could speak everyone's language.
Exactly. Furthermore, Groves noted what he called an overweening ambition in Oppenheimer. He knew that ambition would provide the relentless drive needed to actually deliver the weapon.
So Oppenheimer directs the project to a location that bridges his two great loves. A flat mesa in New Mexico called the Los Alamos Ranch School.
Back to the desert.
Back to the desert. And the administrative scale of what happens next is just hard to overstate. It went from a plan for a few hundred scientists to a sprawling secret city of over 6,000 people.
And he was intellectually and physically present at every crucial junction. He wasn't just managing from a desk.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we look at this through a leadership lens, it's not just about gathering the world's best violinists to play a symphony.
Right.
It's about taking the theoretical physicists and forcing them to play in the exact same key as the explosives engineers and the metallurgists, all while racing a ticking clock.
And that interdisciplinary tuning became a matter of life and death when their initial design failed.
The Thin Man design, right?
Yes. They originally pursued a gun-type plutonium weapon called Thin Man, which worked by firing one piece of fissile material into another to create a critical mass.
Kind of like shooting a bullet into a target.
Exactly like that. But the physicists and chemists realized that the specific plutonium they were producing in reactors contained an isotope that would cause the bomb to pre-detonate.
Meaning it would blow up too early.
It would melt down before it could yield a full nuclear explosion.
Okay, so if the gun-type design is off the table, how do you actually force that material into a critical state without it fizzling out?
That is where Oppenheimer had to pivot the entire laboratory toward an incredibly complex implosion design known as the Christie gadget.
Implosion meaning blowing inward.
Yes. The mechanism required arranging conventional explosive lenses in a perfect sphere around a solid core of plutonium. These explosives had to detonate with microsecond precision, creating a symmetrical shock wave that squeezed the solid metal core inward.
Wow.
Squeezing it doubled its normal density and initiated the chain reaction.
And the culmination of that intense interdisciplinary gamble happened on July 16, 1945, at the Trinity test.
The physical toll on Oppenheimer in that control bunker was immense.
I can't even imagine the stress.
Observers noted he was scarcely breathing as the countdown ticked away, just holding onto a post to steady himself. When the flash of the explosion finally arrived, followed by the shockwave, his face just relaxed into sheer, immense relief.
It is the moment that cemented his legacy, and it brought a line from his Sanskrit translation of the Bhagavad Gita to his mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
This raises an important question, though, because it underscores the impossible moral pivot these scientists were suddenly forced to make.
What do you mean?
Well, the Manhattan Project was born out of sheer terror that Hitler would build the bomb first. But Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945.
Oh, right. 2 months before the test.
By the time the Trinity test proved the bomb worked in July, the original existential threat was gone. The scientists realized they hadn't just beaten the Nazis. They had birthed the architectural plans for human extinction.
And following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Oppenheimer became a national icon. He was the face of this terrifying new technocratic power.
But internally, the reality of what he had unleashed was really eating at him.
By October of that year, he is in the Oval Office meeting with President Harry Truman, and he confesses, "I feel I have blood on my hands."
That statement fundamentally alienated the president. Truman felt that the moral weight of using the weapon rested entirely on the commander-in-chief, not the scientists who built it.
Truman didn't want to hear it.
Not at all. Truman threw him out of the office and privately referred to Oppenheimer as a son of a bitch.
That deep ideological fracture points directly to the final phase of his life, his brutal Cold War fall from grace.
Well, it was a steep fall.
After the war, Oppenheimer served as the director of the Institute for Advanced Study and the chairman of the General Advisory Committee for the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, and he used those positions to try and halt the very arms race he had initiated.
The tipping point came in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The U.S. political and military establishment completely panicked.
And their immediate solution was to escalate, right? By developing the hydrogen bomb or the super.
Yes.
Yeah.
To understand why Oppenheimer fought this so fiercely, we have to look at the physics separating these two weapons. The bombs used in World War II relied on fission, splitting heavy atomic nuclei apart.
Right.
But the proposed hydrogen bomb relied on fusion forcing light atomic nuclei together, essentially replicating the intense mechanics of a star here on Earth.
So a completely different scale of destruction.
The resulting explosion wouldn't just be incrementally larger, it would be thousands of times more powerful. Oppenheimer opposed the H-bomb on practical grounds, arguing the initial designs were flawed, but his primary opposition was ethical.
Because it's just too big to use on a battlefield.
Exactly. A fusion weapon has no tactical military use. Its blast radius is so massive that its only practical function is the absolute extermination of civilian populations and entire cities.
He recognized the mechanics of what political scientists call the security dilemma.
How does that work?
Well, if the U.S. builds a fusion bomb to feel safer, the Soviets will inevitably view that as an existential offensive threat and build their own.
Right, locking the world into an arms race.
Exactly, locking the world into a suicidal escalation where nobody is actually secure.
But the government ignored his warnings. President Truman ordered the H-bomb developed. And in the paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, Oppenheimer's resistance made him a target.
Powerful adversaries, including AEC Commissioner Lewis Strauss and physicist Edward Teller, determined that Oppenheimer's ongoing influence over nuclear policy was a liability.
Which led directly to the 1954 security clearance hearing. The FBI had been surveilling Oppenheimer for years, tapping his phones, bugging his home. They leveraged his past associations against him.
To understand how McCarthy-era tactics functioned, you have to look at how they weaponized a specific event called the Chevalier Incident.
Yes, that was a huge part of the hearing. During the war, Oppenheimer had fabricated a convoluted story to Manhattan Project security officers to protect his friend, Håkon Chevalier.
Because Chevalier had mentioned a back channel to the Soviets, right?
Right, Chevalier had casually mentioned a potential back channel to pass information to the Soviets.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer had ultimately admitted to the lie, but during the 1954 hearing, the prosecution used that past fabrication, combined with his pre-war political ties, to paint a picture of a man who was fundamentally untrustworthy.
They didn't need to prove he was a Soviet spy. They just needed to prove he was a security risk.
And Edward Teller delivered the fatal blow to his former boss.
What did Teller say?
Teller testified that while he didn't question Oppenheimer's loyalty, he found his decisions complicated. He stated, "I would feel personally more secure if public matters would rest in other hands."
Wow, that is brutal.
The Atomic Energy Commission ultimately voted 2-1 to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. They cited defects of character and his past associations. He was effectively exiled from the inner circles of government, becoming a prominent martyr for McCarthyism.
It is worth noting that the U.S. Energy Secretary completely vacated that flawed 1954 decision in 2022, but, during Oppenheimer's lifetime, the damage was absolute.
So what does this all mean? If we connect this to the bigger picture, the structural shift happening here is profound.
Right. It's like building the ultimate Pandora's box for your boss, realizing your mistake, begging them to put a padlock on it, and then getting fired and investigated for treason simply for warning them about the monsters inside.
That's a great way to put it. Oppenheimer's exile signaled the harsh new reality of big science. The era of scientists operating independently, purely pursuing esoteric knowledge, was dead. Scientific research had irrevocably merged with the military-industrial complex.
The new rule was clear. If the government funds your research to unlock the secrets of the universe, the government owns the results, and they expect absolute compliance regarding how those secrets are used.
Stripped of his political leverage, Oppenheimer retreated to a Spartan beach house on the island of St. John.
Back to a kind of isolation.
He received a symbolic gesture of rehabilitation in 1963 when Lyndon B. Johnson presented him with the Enrico Fermi Award, acknowledging his immense contributions to science. But he never regained his security clearance. He passed away from throat cancer in 1967.
Looking at his life, you see the ultimate distillation of the modern dilemma. It is the friction between the relentless, driving pursuit of knowledge and the crushing moral responsibility for how that knowledge is applied.
Because once the equation is solved and the mechanism is proven, you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
No, you can't.
The knowledge belongs to the world.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. In 1953, right before the government stripped him of his clearance and his voice, Oppenheimer made a public plea.
He urged the United States government to practice less secrecy and more openness toward the American people regarding the terrifying realities of the nuclear balance.
He believed the public had a right and a need to understand exactly what was sitting in those silos. So imagine, just for a moment, what the trajectory of the Cold War and our inherent trust in both government and science today might look like if the powers that be had listened. What if, at the very dawn of the atomic age, they had chosen radical transparency instead of absolute secrecy?